Committee will come to order. Good afternoon to everyone. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Senator Nelson, it's good to have you back here on the Hill. You're home, away from home, visiting the subcommittee to help us examine NASA's fiscal 24 budget request. We thank you for being here. We have worked together over the years in one place or another, and we look forward to working with you now as you head up NASA. The Biden administration is requesting $27.2 billion in funding for NASA. That's a roughly 7% increase over current level. And as you know, Congress has provided $367 million in emergency funding for NASA construction and environmental compliance in fiscal 23. Funding NASA at the appropriate level while remaining focused on the continued growth in government is a difficult balance to strike. We want to ensure that the United States remains the world leader in space, particularly in light of the aggressive investments China has made in space exploration. We're also accountable to the taxpayer to ensure that NASA remains focused on its core mission. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration was founded in 1958 to establish a civilian-focused, peaceful space science agency in response to the space race to land the first man on the moon. The space race inspired many Americans, including a young man working at a radio station in western North Carolina, to pursue careers in space. After some effort in pursuit of that goal at the University of Kentucky, I realized I was better suited to be a lawyer. So I continue my fascination with space along with Americans across generations, including young Americans who watched the Artemis 1 launch or viewed with awe the remarkable images from the James Webb Space Telescope. NASA's major achievements in 2022, almost too numerous to list. To achieve new levels of success, we now look toward Artemis 2 and 3 and the goal of returning American astronauts to the moon in 2025. I'm pleased to see NASA and its diverse workforce of engineers, scientists, and explorers leveraging partnerships and competition to drive affordability and innovation. Our investments in NASA not only impact the current generation of engineers and scientists, but they also empower the next generation, such as the students at Morehead State University in my home district. At Morehead, students are doing critical research in space science and are entering the space workforce in a part of the country that's traditionally not known for space innovations. Further, through NASA EPSCoR program, NASA is reaching into communities that might not otherwise have the same exposure to space research and innovation. NASA has set forth an ambitious but important agenda. Today, I'll have some questions about NASA's preparedness to explore the moon and beyond, our efforts to outcompete China, and the impact of inflation on NASA projects and missions. So thank you, Mr. Director, for joining us today. Let me first recognize my partner, Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you our Administrator Nelson for joining us once again and taking our questions as we endeavor to fund your agency. And NASA continues to be respected through the world as a leader in advancing our knowledge of the Earth, the solar system, the wider universe, as well as advancing human space exploration, developing new technologies with wide applications, helping to establish more fuel-efficient and environmentally friendly aviation. It is my hope that NASA will continue to inspire young Americans to pursue STEM-related careers. As an example, for the second year in a row, undergraduate students in my home city of Scranton, at the University of Scranton, were among students who built atmospheric sensing devices that were later launched into space as part of NASA's Rock On program. NASA continues to move from strength to strength. From the Artemis 1 launch that went beautifully to watching Ingenuity fly on the face of Mars, something nobody thought you could do. NASA did it. The impeccable unfolding of the James Webb Space Telescope, the OSIRIS-REx mission that will soon return an asteroid sample to Earth, the Mars sample return mission. NASA also continues its work on a number of critical Earth science programs aimed at advancing our understanding of Earth, and I look forward to hearing about these projects with you, Administrator Nelson. In addition, NASA's Aeronautics program is critical to advancing our goal of reaching net zero carbon emissions from the aviation sector no later than 2050. But I do continue to be greatly concerned that powerful forces in our House of Representatives are planning and pushing for drastic cuts across the board in discretionary spending. These are proposals that would greatly harm various NASA initiatives that contribute so much to our scientific understanding, our economic development, and our standing in the world. So I look forward to hearing more from you today about these potential impacts, as well as how NASA plans on managing all of the agency's endeavors in a cost-effective manner. Thank you very much, Mr. Administrator, for being here, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Senator Nelson, you're recognized for an opening statement. Without objection, your written statement will be entered into the record. We hope that you could keep your statement to 5 minutes or so to give us time for more questions. So, sir, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, I want to say that I have been to most of your states, and we have a lot of NASA activity in your states. Most recently, I was just in Congressman Garcia's district at Edwards Air Force Base, where we have the Armstrong Flight Test Center. They're named after Neil Armstrong. I've been many times to Congressman Adderholt's district, which was right outside of Huntsville. As a matter of fact, I was trained there and in Birmingham at University of Birmingham and Alabama's medical school in my primary research project when I flew on the space shuttle back in the early part of the space shuttle program. And I want to thank all of you for not only for your public service, but for your interest in high tech. Congressman Cartwright just mentioned, a benefit that comes out of this, and you saw it a half century ago that came out of the Apollo, is for 2 generations we produced engineers and technicians and scientists and mathematicians that all came out of young people getting so ginned up and inspired. And we are seeing that now. It's not the Apollo generation, it's the Artemis generation. going back to the moon and then going on to Mars and beyond. And that very same thing is happening. And you can see it if you walk into any elementary school classroom. Watch how their eyes brighten when you start talking about space. So between the two of you, Mr. Chairman, you all have just outlined a number of things in NASA. I want to give you the time for the questions, and I would just venture to mention one other thing, and it's illustrative of the fact that the chairman has kindly invited me to come to Morehead State, and as a result of that, it's emblematic that we are making a concerted effort at our grants and other distribution of NASA so that we do not miss any of this country, in this particular case, a geographical issue. A recent grant to the University of Wyoming is another indication. We want the high technology to be stimulated and worked with NASA in all parts of the country. So, Mr. Chairman, I'll stop right there and take your comments and questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Administrator, for those remarks. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions for the witness, and I'll begin by recognizing myself. Senator, lunar exploration is an expensive endeavor, and a sustained U.S. presence on the moon will require a substantial funding commitment. Are you confident NASA's 24 budget request will allow the U.S. to stay ahead of international rivals such as China and maintain a technological edge to continue as a leader in lunar exploration?
Yes, sir. On the present schedule, we just announced the crew of 4, 3 Americans and a Canadian. They will go on Artemis II. Congressman Elzey flew in the Navy with the fella that has been tapped by NASA, Reed Wiseman, to be the commander of this mission. He's the former chief of the astronaut office, just an exceptional person, as is each of these 4 that were named. And that will be at the end of next year. It basically takes 2 years because of a spending decision that was made years ago that they were going to save some money by taking the avionics out of Artemis 1 and putting in Artemis 2. And you got to go through the requalification as well as the putting in of these avionics. It takes 2 years. So the fact that our test flight, which went so well, didn't go until November of last year, it's going to be November of 2024. Then we would anticipate about a year that Artemis 3 would go. That could be the end of 25. It could be into 26. And that's when we will send a crew of 4, go into a lunar orbit, and they will rendezvous with a SpaceX lander, and 2 of the 4 will go down for a 6-day mission on the surface. And that will be the first woman and the next man that will walk on the moon. That mission, by the way, is indicative of our public-private partnership, which thus far has been enormously successful. And that public-private partnership is best shown by us sending crew and cargo to the International Space Station, now on SpaceX, soon to be Boeing, and then cargo on other companies as well. Tomorrow morning, we are anxious to see if the first test flight of this huge rocket down in Boca Chica, Texas, right just north of the Rio Grande, if it is successful. And that's the beginning of that commercial partner linking up with us in lunar orbit for Artemis 3. And I can take you through the rest of them later on, whatever's your pleasure, Mr. Chairman.
Why are you not using Canaveral for that launch?
This is the decision of the commercial company which acquired this, and they're going to do their first test flights there. I think they'll probably do 5. And so if they start blowing up things in their test flights, which is not uncommon for how SpaceX has produced a very successful low Earth orbit program, once they get through and get some experience, then they bring that rocket to Cape Canaveral and the Kennedy Space Center.
It's pretty commonly believed that the U.S. race to the moon, the Apollo program, was actually in response to the competition from Russia, who also was racing to the moon. If that's true, and I think it is, are we in a space race with China now, much the same as we were in the Apollo years?
Not the same as Apollo, but we're in a space race with China. China has, in the last 10 years, established a very successful human space program. You might, from time to time, notice that some of their hardware looks a lot like ours or the European Space Agency hardware. Nevertheless, the fact is that they are only the second nation to successfully land a rover on the surface of Mars. They are now successfully having put together 3 different components into a Chinese space station in low Earth orbit. And they have declared publicly that they are going with taikonauts to the moon. So is that a space race? Yes, sir, I believe it is. But there are other reasons that we go to the moon because we're going to Mars. And we go back to the moon for the purpose of learning to live, to work, to invent, to create, to do all of the things that we have to do to advance technology and to enable us to be able to allow humans to go all the way to Mars. The moon's only a few days away. Mars is months and months away. And that's another reason that one of the items in front of you all is getting faster propulsion. We need to go faster. And so you've got proposals in front of you for nuclear thermal propulsion and nuclear electric propulsion.
Thank you. Mr. Cartwright?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Administrator Nelson, first of all, thank you for coming last year to the Keystone State. Your visit to the Keystone Space Collaborative Conference was much appreciated, and your visit to Astrobotic and visit with John Thornton's company. I was pleased to join you there. I'll be there again this year in about a month, and look forward to that. I joined the chairman, and you as well said it, the value of NASA in inspiring young people. It cannot be stated strongly enough what that does for this country, what it did. Yes, we were in a space race with Russia, and look at what it led to. The inspiration of generations of engineers and scientists and all sorts of occupations that led to the discoveries that made life better and created wealth. You know, if you look at the Fortune 500 list of companies in this country, the ones crowding the top in terms of wealth, they weren't around a couple of generations ago. We all know that. And it's because they came up, they sprang forward as a result of the brainchild of some young person who went into science, technology, engineering, and math, and if not for the inspiration of those people, that wealth would not exist. We have to create wealth in this country. We have to create wealth in the world. And so I commend you for continuing to push this great inspiration-driving enterprise called NASA. And I want to ask you, there are voices in the House that I mentioned who want to cut everything. They want to cut everything across the board, 22% for non-discretionary spending. And given the important role of NASA that I just described for our American wealth, for our American prosperity, for our future, does that make any sense, cutting NASA across the board? And what would it mean to projects like Artemis, which is pretty obviously keyed toward inspiring not just people, but women to go into STEM and to create discoveries? How smart would that be to cut Artemis 22%? How smart would it be to cut the James Webb telescope program 22%? What do you think, Administrator?
First of all, I want to note for the rest of the committee members that in Congressman Cartwright's state is a very good example of commercial activity joining with NASA, because he's got a company called Astrobotic out in Pittsburgh that is going to launch a payload to the South Pole of the Moon to start characterizing the South Pole, where we want to land our astronauts in late 25. That's a very dangerous region of the moon, because if you think, if this is the bottom of the moon, the sunlight's coming in at an angle, and there are deep shadows, and there are lots of places, especially the craters, that there is no sunlight. But we know there's water there. And that's why we want to go there, because if you got water, and his company has got an instrument that's going to dig for water. If you got water, you got hydrogen and oxygen, you got a gas station. So let me answer your question specifically. A 22% cut or a continuing resolution that would leave the funding at the 23 level. It's going to cause a slowdown of programs at NASA across the board.
And how smart is that, given the fact that we do have to compete with the Chinese, whether it's a space race or whatever you want to call it? We still have to compete with the Chinese. They're going to the moon, aren't they, Administrator Nelson?
Yes, sir. As I mentioned, I think you will find that when the American people see something like that, we can put a rover on Mars, and then we can put a helicopter that flies in a 1% atmosphere, and it not only flies for a demonstration, it just completed its 50th flight just a few days ago. When they see that there's an asteroid coming at its closest point to Earth, 7 million miles away, and we can put a spacecraft on the bullseye and knock that asteroid off of its trajectory, when they see the space telescope that the chairman mentioned, that's bringing these untold discoveries for us about our universe and how big it is and what it is to help us understand where we are and who we are, or when they can see the largest, most powerful rocket go on a test flight, thank the good Lord, into an almost flawless mission that we actually added tests in the course of the 26-day mission to get ready to put humans on the top of it. The American people see this and they want more of this. And so any kind of slowdown or cancellation is going to be inimical, this country boy believes, to the interest of our country.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Administrator Nelson, for being here. I want to commend you all for thinking fiscally responsibly and partnering with the Canadians. At the outset of my comments, I hadn't thought about it, but when you're headed to the concert and you only got a limited number of seats in your car, you may make room for the guy who's going to pay gas money to hitch a ride. So we're glad that you're partnering. I don't know. Can you tell me exactly how much gas money are the Canadians providing?
They are providing the arm known as the Canadian arm that will go on the mini space station that will go in lunar orbit. And they provided the arm on the space shuttle, enormously successful. They have the arm on the International Space Station, enormously important and successful. And they're going to provide this arm on the lunar outpost called Gateway.
Good. I want to circle back to when you were talking about nuclear thermal propulsion. The budget funds $15.8 million for nuclear thermal propulsion research, but NASA recently announced a partnership with DARPA, known as DRACO, to research nuclear thermal propulsion that's expected to cost NASA roughly $90 million. How does NASA intend to fund its part of this DARPA agreement without a request for the full amount for DRACO?
That's where we're going in and we're sharing cost with other, in this case, agencies that have an interest in doing that. DARPA for its own reasons, us for our reasons. And we're looking forward in the future to doing something on nuclear electric propulsion as well with some other agency so that we share the cost. This program going back to the moon and then to Mars is not like the program that went to the moon 50 years ago. Then it was the U.S. government, totally. This time we go with international partners which share the cost, as well as our commercial partners that share the cost. And this research that you mentioned is an example of that.
Good. You talked about China, and you noted that NASA and China have coordinated over issues such as the orbits of Mars spacecraft, but added that there's a lack of needed transparency on the Chinese side. Can you tell us about what you mean there? And when you mentioned the possibility of cooperating further with China is up to China, is that such a wise waiting game to play?
Well, first of all, we have a law that says that we can't cooperate. As a matter of fact, it's named after a former member of this committee, this subcommittee as well.
Actually, we overlap in territory in Northern Virginia. The
There you go,
Wolf
Frank Wolf.
language.
Yep, I served with him in the House, as did the chairman. So that's number one. There's a law, but that law can be suspended by the direction of the administrator. We did that on one occasion where we needed to deconflict the orbit on Mars because they've got a Mars orbiter. And as I mentioned, they've got a Mars rover. I think it's gone to sleep, but they had successfully landed a Mars rover. But we've had no success in getting them to be open and transparent. They are very secretive. And so they've put up 3 elements of their space station. And each time they did not reserve fuel for control of their booster rocket coming back in. And each time when we asked them to give us the coordinates, the trajectory, they refused to share that. 3 times, not once. The second time, by the way, we thought it might go down in Greece. Then we thought it might go down in Saudi Arabia. Fortunately, it went down in the Indian Ocean. So I can go into more detail. I actually ran into the Chinese ambassador about a year ago in a Sunday brunch. He said, "What can we do?" I said, "Well, I'll give you an example. You just returned a sample from the moon. We did lots of samples half a century ago. We made it available to the international community. You could do that as well."
Well, I'd say
That was a year ago.
we
Nothing.
didn't cooperate with the Soviet Union back in the 60s during the space race. I don't think it'd be wise to cooperate with the Chinese now. I yield back. Thank you.
And by the way, if I may, Mr. Chairman, the one exception is, and the irony, as bad as the things are with President Putin now, we have had cooperation in space with first the Soviets back in 1975 in the middle of the Cold War, the Apollo-Soyuz mission where they rendezvoused and docked and lived together in space. And we've had that cooperation with the Russians ever since. They invited us to come and dock with their first space station. We did that with the space shuttle, their station called Mir. And then we built the International Space Station with the Russians. And it takes both of us to operate it. We have integrated crews. We have an American astronaut that trains in Moscow and flies on the Soyuz. We have a Russian cosmonaut that trains in Houston and flies, so that we have an integrated crew in case something happened to either launch vehicle, that we'd still have an integrated crew to operate the space station. This is the anomaly in geopolitics today. With what we see on the face of the earth, what Putin is doing in Ukraine, and all of the terrible things that are happening there. And yet we have a very professional, successful program between our astronauts and the cosmonauts.
You're right, that is an anomaly. Ms. Bing?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Nelson, for your service to this nation, and welcome back to our subcommittee. It's great to see you. I want to again thank you and your team for helping facilitate astronaut Johnny Kim's visit to my district in Queens last year. He visited 2 schools, and as I've continuously heard from students and teachers, he really had a lasting impact on their future aspirations, whether it's to be an astronaut or any other field. They heard his personal and phenomenal story, asked him questions about his journey to NASA, and it was an exceptional experience that helped socialize in their minds that they could be anything they want, maybe even an astronaut. And experiences like this are so important to inspiring the next generation of STEM workers. As we ramp up federal investments in STEM programs, including at NASA, and compete internationally to grow and attract talent, it is surprising and concerning that some of our colleagues on the other side have proposed that we return to fiscal year 22 funding levels for this year's budget. And just to highlight some of the amazing programs and impact that NASA has had in my district, we have Queens College, a public university, where one of my constituents literally helped develop software for Artemis 1. In Queensboro Community College, another public university, They've enjoyed and benefited from so many NASA awards and grants that have really expanded their opportunities. So I wanted to ask do you believe that we can sufficiently inspire our next generation of students to pursue STEM careers if we revert to fiscal year 22 funding levels?
We are actively, vigorously using the fascination with space successfully to get kids excited about science, technology, engineering, mathematics. In my former life, about 10 years ago, I lived through a 3-week shutdown, as we all did, of the United States government. That is not a pretty picture. In my former life, I have lived through a 10-year sequester of the budget with all the attempts to make exceptions in the course of that decade. That is not a pretty picture in a way to do budgeting. So I can just tell you from my experience in the past and seeing what it did to our space program at the time and what I would interpolate that it would do for the future of NASA, I don't think that is a good outcome.
Do you believe that if we reverted back to fiscal year 22 levels, it would have an impact on the number of American jobs currently existing in this country and being able to expand the number of American jobs?
Yes, ma'am. If you take a 22% cut and you apply that to NASA's civil service, you're talking about 20,000 people being laid off of NASA's some 60,000. And that's civil servants and contractors. There is a direct relationship between what NASA does and the total number of jobs that are produced in the country, which is something like 400,000 jobs. So if you take that and multiply that times, you're talking about a major amount of jobs that would be affected.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, thank you, Mr. Administrator. The visit to the district was very uplifting for many of our constituents and especially our youth. We're going to continue to get the message out. Thank you for selecting 3 Hornet pilots to fly on Artemis II. It's a very good testimony to the naval aviation, as well as our Canadian F-18 friends. So,
By the way, I did not make those selections.
no, I'm sure you did. I'm sure. Clearly, you did not.
That's done by
Yeah,
the
that's
Director of Flight Operations and the Chief Astronaut. They make those
We'll
selections.
give them my thanks in regards. I want to thank you, though, sir. A member of Congress, a senator, an astronaut. Your service to the country is exemplary, and we will have a hard time quantifying everything you've done for our beautiful nation, especially NASA, and now in this role. So, thank you for your service. Not too bad for an Army guy. We appreciate everything you've done for the country, and now for this very important endeavor. I think NASA is getting the bang for the buck. There's very few federal agencies I can say that for. We are getting a return on the investments that we've been making over the last 10 years, and we've started to reinvigorate this renaissance of space exploration. The public-private partnership that we're getting from not just the government, but companies like SpaceX. Artemis is a great example. The partnership on Perseverance and the ingenuity, being able to fly a helicopter in the atmosphere of another planet less than 120 years from when we actually flew for the first time in our own planet's atmosphere is pretty incredible. These are unifying missions and truly inspiring endeavors for a country that needs this mission and this inspiration. So I think we are getting the ROI. When we look at the budgets,
you're averaging about 6.5% year over year over the last 2 years. This pales in comparison to what other federal agencies have been asking for and getting. We're seeing things well over 20% over the last 2 years in other federal agencies. So we need to keep an eye on all the dollars. I think the ranking member eloquently described powerful forces that are hurting our budgets. And to me, the most powerful force that's crushing us, this very brutish, sort of oppressive and evil force called inflation, is making it so that your 24 or $27 billion, whatever the number ends up being, is behaving about 20% less effective and less efficient than it was just 3 years ago. So you have my commitment, and I think a lot of Republicans, especially in the House right now, to start to really fight this evil inflation problem that we have, so that whatever the investments we have, not only do we realize efficiencies, but we get a little more spending power out of this money going forward. So that is a key focus. I want to pivot to a deep space exploration question on the life support systems side of the House. We have the space station that has been growing, and we've been gathering data and learning experiences, but from a life support perspective, that's true as well. What are we able to harness and sort of leverage from the space station experiences that can help us, maybe burn down some risk and get up the TRL levels on deeper space missions, longer expeditions, in terms of, you got more challenging mass, you've got longer radiation exposures, harder resiliency requirements. How are we leveraging space station lessons learned into these longer duration flights?
And by the way, Congressman, you just made the argument of why we need to go back to the moon before we go to Mars, not only to create the technologies that can get us there and sustain human life and bring them home safely.
That's right.
But it is the space station, which is your specific question, that has given us the experience of long duration in zero G, not only to do research, such as the pharmaceutical research that's going on, but also how can we grow things so that we could produce agricultural food for a trip that may make, if we don't speed up the propulsion, may take 2 years.
Right.
And so all of that is enabled by the research and the experience that has been going on in zero G, and the adaptation of developments such as spacesuits that can serve us then, not only our experience on the surface of the moon a half century ago, but what we're going to need in the future. So
that includes
it's
the
invaluable.
life support systems in the craft as well. So thank you, Mr. Administrator, Senator. Thank you for your service again. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Ruppersberger?
Thank you. First, just a couple things. Reed Wiseman, who is going to be the leader on the next, they're leaving the 25th, I believe. I'm not sure what the date is a neighbor of mine. His parents are friends of ours. He went to all public school, and we're all very proud of him. But it's just an example of programs that we have now that kids like, and they stay with it. And I just want to mention him. I've also, in the past, you and I have worked together, and I think you're doing a great job at NASA. It's got to be a bipartisan project. Anything that works in this town it really is bipartisan if it works. And we have to balance issues on both sides, and you've done that. And you've also communicated that what needs to be done, why you're doing it, and where we're going. So we just appreciate where you are, and I'm glad that you're where you are. China is the big issue. I mean, they're our competitor. We need to stay with them and pass them, hopefully. In Politico article, you said it's a fact that we're in a space race, and it is true that we better watch out that they don't get a place on the moon under the guise of scientific research. And it's not beyond the realm possibility that they can say, hey, we're here, keep out, this is our country now. And those are good words. We need to keep taking and challenging China. Now, can you talk about China's ambitions getting to the moon, what impact the House majority's efforts to go back to FY '22. I just can't believe it. When it comes to space and national security, to talk about just going back to 22, it makes no sense. It's not American. And we as members have to come together and make sure we work this out on both sides of the aisle, believe me. I just want your opinion about where China is, what we have to deal with, and what Congress needs to do to get this fixed and move on so we can do what's right for our country.
Before I answer your question on China, I mentioned earlier that another member of your committee, Congressman Elsie, flew with Reed F-18s off the deck of a carrier. And indeed, I want the rest of you all to know Congressman Dutch Ruppersberger and former member of this committee, John Culberson, on the last day of the session before the August recess in 2010, where we were desperate to get the NASA 2010 bill passed because it set us off on this course that we're on, going back to the moon, as well as the dual course of the government program and the commercial program. And that bill would not have passed in the House of Representatives. First of all, had the majority leader not put it on the suspension calendar after dressing me down of saying that we have to take the Senate bill or nothing. And I said, but Steny, you're going to love this bill. And then, if it had not been for the two congressmen, including John Culberson, taking me by the hand for the entire day into the evening, so that by the time they brought it up on the suspension calendar, it passed with a 3/4 vote. And we didn't have the votes early in the day. So I give great credit to the two members of Congress. All right,
Thank you.
China. What I have said is that it is very typical that we need to protect our interests going to a very critical part of the moon's surface. This isn't like going to the equatorial part of the moon that is constantly lit. This is where the shadows are deep and there are lots of huge craters. And you've got to be right on the money in your landing. And there is limited space in which to look for that water. And what I've said is, you let China get there first. What's to stop them from saying, since they're not a part of the Artemis Accords that have been signed by 22 countries, what's to stop them from saying, we're here, this is our area, you stay out? And that's why I think it's important for us to get there on an international mission and establish the rules of the road, which is here, it's for peaceful purposes, and it's for all of us to cooperate together.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Clyde.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator Nelson, for being here today. As you well know, Washington's out-of-control spending habits have ballooned our national debt and put our national security at risk. As we speak today, our national debt stands at nearly $31.7 trillion. Yet the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office predicts that it will only worsen. According to the CBO's Budget and Economic Outlook, deficits are expected to double over the next decade, and public debt is expected to increase by $22 trillion. One thing is abundantly clear: it's past time for Congress to take a look at how the federal government is spending its taxpayer dollars. I mean, American citizens understand that they cannot be continually spending more than they earn, and neither should the government. That being said, I recognize the importance of NASA's work in advancing our national security and economic interests, and pushing the bounds of space and aviation technologies. As we have seen, with the Chinese Communist Party's immense investment in their aerospace sectors, it's clear the next great military domain is going to be space. Therefore, it is critical that NASA's advancements in aerospace remain on track, and it's my goal to ensure that every dollar appropriated to NASA is efficiently and effectively used to advance our nation's national and economic security. With NASA deep into its Artemis mission to send American astronauts back to the moon, it is now more important than ever that Congress hold NASA accountable to their schedules and budgets to prevent ballooning mission costs. In fact, according to a March 22 GAO report, key Artemis III mission programs have already experienced more than $1 billion growth in cost. Furthermore, NASA has already delayed key Artemis mission deadlines, as you mentioned a little earlier, and schedules costing taxpayer money, or costing taxpayers even more. Each Artemis mission is inherently intertwined, and every delay and deficiency to an Artemis mission jeopardizes the whole program and balloons costs to taxpayers. I get that. So in the current fiscal state of our nation, this simply cannot be allowed to continue. So recognizing that we have a ballooning national debt and a deficit every year, what areas of NASA would you look to cut so that you can prioritize the most important missions of NASA?
Or save.
Either one,
And,
go ahead.
A good example is we're sharing cost
No, I get that.
with our international partners,
right,
with our commercial
Right,
partners.
I get the sharing costs bit. I want to know
Okay?
where NASA
I'll
can
give
cut
you a
our
specific example.
expenditures. Yes, sir.
Specific example. We inherited this cost overrun of the SLS rocket. 16 contractors. We're consolidating all of that into one contract that's going to basically be managed by Boeing to try to get the economies out of 16 separate things. But the other thing that I would remind you, you're dealing, Congressman, in an area that's best said by President Kennedy when he went to Rice University Stadium 60 years ago. And he said, we go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Space is hard. This is first of impression stuff that we are creating and inventing. So let me give you an example. The Space Telescope that's out there 1 million miles. It's bringing us this incredible wealth of new information about the universe. It was way over cost, and it was way behind time. It's hard, but when it happened, 344 things had to work perfectly, and they all worked perfectly in order to put it there. And so we are going to do, as NASA, everything humanly possible, but I would implore you to understand the environment in which we're operating is a very difficult one.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, but I also appreciate, and I think the country does too, that we simply have to do that within fiscal constraints. We're already seeing nations across the world, primarily China, working to upset our primary position as being the world's reserve currency. And if we ever lose that position, we lose significant portions of our ability to borrow money and people wanting to purchase our debt, which will simply lower our financial position. So we have to look at where we are spending our money, making it the spending most effective and efficient. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Trone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Administrator Nelson. It's great to see you again, and I just can't thank you enough for the work you did at Goddard when we saw the web results come back. I was there with the senators, and it was just spectacular, and these photos you gave us are really mind-blowing, and the data we're going to learn is just so important. And you're right, we do it because it's hard. And so thank you for all that. And thanks for picking first woman and the first person of color. Your team picked to circle the moon. That's going to inspire a lot of generations to come of young women and people of color. So is fantastic. I have a couple of questions about the roles of the NASA centers evolving, given the advancements of technology in the rapidly growing commercial space industry. So what efforts are the NASA centers undertaking to enable commercial companies to license NASA-developed technology in a more timely and more effective manner?
Well, Congressman, we do this as a matter of course. For example, when we have people doing research on the International Space Station, and they create something, we don't keep that at NASA. We allow that to be marketed, especially if it has a salutary effect for humankind. And that's been NASA's policy all along. So often contractors are developing with NASA incentive dollars new kinds of technology. And we want that to get out to the commercial sector. And the best example that I could give you is what's in your pocket, every one of you right now. A cell phone that's got this amazing camera. That's a camera on a chip. That camera was developed by NASA on our Earth observing program. And so look what good that's done in the commercial sector for people to really do good financially. But look what it's done for humanity.
Oh, we appreciate that. The one thing we hear from some of our contractors is timely. So whatever you can do to help push and move things faster. I know you're a veteran of many bureaucracies and wars for your public service, but timely would be important. The other thing, what plans does NASA have for better supporting and utilizing these growing commercial space industry? And how can NASA partner with these commercial companies who bring a lot of innovation? They bring a lot of speed, and also they bring non-government funding.
That is well said, and that's exactly why we have this commercial program that we are coordinating with. And at the end of the day, just take, for example, low Earth orbit, where we have the International Space Station, which is primarily a government-funded project between us, the Russians, the Japanese, the European Space Agency, and a host of other countries. What we want to do, specifically to your point, is to bring business off the face of the Earth up into low Earth orbit. We want business, commercial activities to take over and have a commercial space station, because we're going to keep our station going until 2030, and then we're going to deorbit it. And we think there's a need for a continuing space station. Certainly, we would become a lessee training astronauts in zero-G on a commercial station and doing other research. But we want to get our focus out beyond low Earth orbit. And it's the commercial sector that can do that. And we are doing that right now. These private astronaut missions that we allow them to come to the International Space Station, that's all a part of us trying to build up a commercial marketplace.
We appreciate that. Let's keep after that. My time's running out quickly, but what's your plans to increase funding on programs like Tipping Point and the announcement for the collaborative opportunity?
Well, any incentive that we can do to bring new technologies to light and then get it out to the American people, we're going to do that. And we're going to give those incentives. And what we find is that's leveraging taxpayer dollars, where the business puts their money with it. You use the creativity and the business ingenuity, and voila, you see what can happen.
Well said. Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Elsey?
Thank you, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Cartwright. I had a whole bunch of questions that I had for you. and they're right out the window. And as I think about what I'm listening to today and what NASA's mission is, it is so many, but at the end of the day, it's inspiration and unification. And as I think about the launch that's coming up in November of 2024, everybody up on this panel went, what's going on in November of 2024? So all I ask of you is, don't do it on November 5th. That's Election Day. But what I'd ask of you is that you do it a week later. And so everybody up on this dais is still going to be here. And I don't think there's anybody who'd rather be here or at that launch more than the folks sitting up on this dais. I want to be there. And then I want to be on the carrier when that mission comes home. Because as a young boy, I watched in 1981 as the first space shuttle mission, STS-1, launched. And I was so proud to be an American. And I was minus 6 months when the first mission went to the moon, so I don't remember it. But it was an inspiration for the whole world at one of the worst times in world history. War all over the place, all kinds of other terrible things going on. So the mission of NASA is inspiration, unification, and bringing up a next generation. And I think we had a lost decade, which I'm very sorry for. But I'm very proud to be a part of this committee, and you should be very proud of what you all are doing right now. When you think about names like Neil, Buzz, Gus, Gordo, Wally, Alan, and Hoot, who you flew with, launching on STS-61, January 12th, 1986, 12 days before my 16th birthday, and I remember that mission. And when you talk about space being hard, 10 days later, Challenger blew up, and it set us back some years. And it unified our nation again in sadness and mourning, but of the greatness of this country and of mankind to reach out into deep space and do great things and unify ourselves. So there's hard things going on in this country right now, and we can talk about cuts, and we can talk about inflation, we can talk about none of that at the end of the day matters. Your mission is an inspirational one. So I can talk about it. $6 trillion, I can talk about inflation. All those things are gonna happen. But you know what I know is gonna happen is in November of 2024, you're gonna launch on another deep space mission around the moon, and I can't wait to watch it. We belong in deep space. And on that day, Tonto and Ike, or Reed and Victor, and Christine and Jeremy, their names are going to be indelibly linked to the next generation of space exploration. And I'm so proud to have flown with Reed Wiseman and gone to his school with his brother. And I think it's a fantastic time. In addition, I flew with 3 of the pilots who are now astronauts, Reed Wiseman, Matt Dominic, and Scott Tingle. All 3 of whom would be deeply embarrassed that I mentioned their names at a congressional hearing in front of the director, but whose bravery and courage and skill is undoubted and an inspiration to us all. From time to time, we forget of the great things that we can do, and we get mired in the details of things that we don't think we can do. But the greatness of the United States is we can. So when I hear people back at home talking about, whatever's going on in the country, and they're scared and they're afraid of China, I'm not afraid of China. Somebody said the other day at another hearing, if they play by the rules, we can beat them. No, we beat them because we're better than they are. And we have to. It's a calling. It is a requirement because this is just like 1969, in my opinion, as far as the space race is concerned. And we're going to beat them. And just like the Soviet Union, it will crumble under its own weight, and we will beat them in every arena. But we have to stand up and have the courage to do so. Now, I know your mission was extremely short, but I'm sure you remember like it was yesterday. And I'm sure that you also remember the first one in 1981, as most of us do, except for the folks sitting behind me. My link to that one is John Young, who was a puking dog, and I was the commanding officer of VFA 143 Puking Dogs. And then I grew up watching The Right Stuff. So I don't have a question for you, sir. Your charge is very, very difficult. But all of us up here have those movies, those journeys that we know that we must go on. And I'm very proud to be a part of this, and I'm very proud of you and your service. And I can't wait to see you the week after Election Day in 2024 in this great mission that we're going to go on. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your service to your country. I yield back.
Well, Congressman, thank you for your statement, and I appreciate it. I want you to know, if I had my druthers, it'd be 6 months before Election Day. But the fact is that all the scientists and the engineers tell me it's going to be 2 years. And the launch of Artemis 1 was at the end of November. So 2 years from then is the end of November, assuming no glitch occurs. End of November 2024. The bottom line is NASA's not going to launch till it's right, till it's safe. We went through 3 scrubs. We went through 2 direct hit hurricanes. Now you're talking to a 5th generation Floridian, and we've never had direct hits on the Kennedy Space Center. We had 2 direct hits in the course. One time had to move that rocket back into the vehicle assembly building. The other time they correctly determined that the winds were not going to be high enough to give a problem to the rocket. We waited until it was right, till it was safe, and then we launched, and the proof's in the pudding.
Gentleman's time has expired. Before I recognize Mr. Adderholt, let me just briefly say how much I appreciated what Ellerslie just related to us. Thank you for those words. That was something that a lot of us had thought. The space program has been a dramatic drama from the very beginning, and it has entertained us along the way as well. But it's had its ups and downs, so to speak. I remember going and watching, being present at the launch of Apollo 13. And we all, of course, knew what happened to 13, but it came through. And it's one of the great mechanical victories in world history that they were able to fix that satellite and save those lives when all was on the line. And it proved again the value of engaging the private sector in the sciences that's required for space flight. And then I was able to go see the first launch of the first shuttle. So I appreciate the gentleman's words about the inspiration aspect of spaceflight, and especially that of NASA. So, thank you. Recognize Mr. Adderholt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Nelson, good to have you here as administrator, and thank you for your service that you perform and over the years. We've talked a lot about China. We've talked about Russia, Soviet Union to a good extent today. And as Congress balances national security priorities and also the spending that we're seeing take place that unfortunately that we do have to keep in mind, and I know Democrats and Republicans alike, understand that. I guess the question I would ask is, are we at risk at losing a new space race with China if we can't support the agency effectively?
I want you to know that at the end of the day, America will prevail. It's just how much do you tie our hands behind our back going into this contest? And therefore, I would say that if we have a budget anywhere like has been proposed, we're going to be able to land the first woman and the next man on the surface of the moon at the end of 25 or into early 26.
Oh, based on you've got a lot of experience, not only in the Congress, but also now as a NASA administrator. How would you describe China in space when considered national security and economic potential?
they're aggressive, they're good, and they're secretive.
Well, the Chinese Communist Party continues to make a priority for its space program, as you all know, and it courts members of the international community despite their known efforts to steal intellectual property. Are we doing anything to prevent, and I say we as NASA, allied agencies like the European Space Agency from aligning with the Chinese?
Absolutely. European Space Agency has been flying with us, with their astronauts, for a number of years. They have a major module on the International Space Station. It's unusual that there's not a European Space Agency astronaut that's on board the International Space Station. It just so happens right now that one of the international partners is the United Arab Emirates that has an astronaut on board the International Space Station. And so you're concerned about China driving a wedge between us? Look what's happened, how Europe has suddenly consolidated as a result of the adventuresome Mr. Putin. It has solidified Europe into the free and Western world in a way we could have never expected. And I think, as you see, China continued to be the outlier, not wanting to be transparent. I think this comes through. And I think that's all the more reason you've made the case right there, why we want to continue to cooperate with these other countries in an international partnership.
Well, despite the Wolf Amendment, who, as you know, we named after Frank Wolf, who we both served with, and several on this committee, the CCP remains effective in stealing intellectual property and other technologies. You mentioned the need for further cybersecurity investments. What is the status of your cybersecurity program currently?
It is increasingly getting better, and it's a lot better than when I came in, and it's for exactly this reason. I had some experience of that in my previous life on Intel, as well as the Cybersecurity Subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee. And that's something that I have insisted on. And I can't tell you the number of millions of hits that we have each day trying to steal stuff from us. So, but that's not unique to NASA. That's every agency of the federal government.
Based on the history of which you served many years in the House and on the Senate, do you think Congress should strengthen the Wolf Amendment?
I think the Wolf Amendment, as it's written, is adequate because it says that you're not going to deal with China unless the administrator of NASA makes an exception that it does not harm national security. Now, thus far, obviously, there's been no reason that we would even consider that. The one time that we cooperated was a few years ago with regard to deconfliction of orbit in Mars. I would hope that China, the Chinese government, would finally come to realize that they've got to be more open and transparent about all of their stuff falling back to Earth, and that we could cooperate together, which is clearly in the interest of not just us, but every nation on Earth. And so I think the Wolf Amendment is sufficient for where it is right now.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. That concludes the first round, I think there's an interest in a second round if the witness has the time to lend us. We will be discreet and quick. And I'll take the first round. Somebody mentioned inflation earlier in this conversation. That's got to be a real problem because the Bureau of Labor Statistics now say that inflation is at 5%. And I think your budget request assumes a 2% inflation rate. Am I correct in that?
I think what you may be referring to is that the administration is assuming an inflation somewhere in 2.5%. But I can't speak to all of the details of that.
But in reality, it's at 5% in the general conversation compared to the 2% that you are assuming. That's got to be inflation's got to be a problem. I mean, it's eating away at your expenditures as well as everything else. Have you given that a lot of thought?
I have, and that's all the more important, Mr. Chairman, that you appropriate what we've requested. It's a $27.2 billion budget. It's a $1.8 billion over 23, and that's a 7.1% increase that we're requesting for 24 over 23.
Yeah. Well, it's something that we'll have to contend with as we write the bill. Let me quickly ask you about the International Space Station. We've been up there, as you say, more than 22 years, and as the space station approaches the end of its useful life and NASA plans for its decommissioning, are you confident a commercial replacement will be completed in time for a transfer of missions in the space program?
That is our intention, and that's why we've given about 4 contracts to 4 different countries, companies, to develop a space station, one of which is actively engaged with us on the space station now, taking these private astronaut missions, which are under severe restrictions as to what they can and cannot do. But having an experience like that, we've also, for example, one of those companies is doing the space suit. There are 2 companies that we've given in competition on the space suits that will be the new space suits that will fit all size astronauts, but are also the updated technology from the years ago technology that is in our existing spacesuits.
But I assume your plan and goal, as far as the space station is concerned, is to have a privately funded substitute take
Yes,
its
sir.
place.
Yes, sir.
Is that correct?
That's correct. And that's why we've given substantial financial incentive from NASA money. It's a part of the budget, present and past, in order to get them to come up with the concepts for a commercial space station, and then NASA will decide among them, not necessarily one, but maybe several.
You think you can make that happen before the present station is decommissioned?
Yes, sir, before 2030, and that's the whole reason that we started this.
I assume you've got a contingency plan taking into account all of the facts of life.
Well, our contingency plan is one of them is going to be successful because come 2030, the station's getting pretty old and we need to deorbit it. And that, of course, is causing an additional drain on our budget this year to the tune of something like $170 million in the budget, just in case we did not have Russia as a partner. We think Russia will be a partner all the way to the end of 2030. But there's something known as geopolitics. And were that not to be the case, we are going and developing the technology to be able to do the deorbit of the entire station by this capability that we are requesting this dollar figure in the budget.
So will the present occupants of the space station, will all of those partners go into the new station?
Well, that's going to depend on the business case that's being made for the commercial station. So if you suddenly have in the early 2030s a commercial station, now we don't have the International Space Station. It's been deorbited. Now, anybody that wants to use the microgravity of orbit to do their research, the pharmaceutical research, the research on new and exotic kind of things, the NASA research on utilizing that as a much cheaper way, instead of having to go all the way to the moon to do the research and eventually to Mars, that we can do continued research in low Earth orbit. And NASA would be a customer of those international, of those commercial space stations, and make it a lot cheaper for NASA.
Mr. Cartwright?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I want to say, I also appreciated Representative Elzey's remarks earlier, and it is something worth saying that it's really cool to have two Hornet pilots on this subcommittee to add their perspective. And we honor your service. And one day we'll find out from Administrator Nelson why neither one of you made it to astronaut. But I want to say this. The subject of inflation has come up, and I agree with the chairman that it is fitting and proper for us to talk about inflation when we're figuring out how many dollars you're going to need to run your agency properly. I agree with Representative Elzey when he said inflation is one of those things that are going to happen. Of course, some of our colleagues have been straining themselves to create a narrative about what caused the current inflation, but we all know that supply chain interruptions cause inflation, and we know it because of history. After World War II, and all of our GIs came home and wanted to buy things and spend money, there was obviously a supply chain interruption. We weren't making cars, we were making planes and tanks in Detroit and all sorts of other supply chain interruptions. And the inflation rate was well into the teens for a couple of years after the end of World War II. It's the same kind of thing we saw with COVID and its interruption of the supply chain. And it's not an American problem. You know, you strain yourself to try to blame the current administration for inflation, but you can't because it's not an American problem. The March figures are out, and in the UK, the annualized CPI, Consumer Price Index inflation, annualized is 10.1%. The average of all the European nations, it's 6.9%. And as our chairman just pointed out, the March figures for America, 5%. So we're grappling with it. It's not fun. We have to deal with it here in appropriations, and it's really hard for people on fixed incomes, seniors, to deal with inflation. We all get that, but let's not strain ourselves to create false narratives here. But in addition to dealing with inflation, we do have to give you hard questions, Mr. Administrator, about corralling your budget and making sure you make smart investments and intelligent improvements on how you spend money. As you know, NASA acquisition management has long been on GAO's high-risk list. Though GAO has also found that over the past several years, NASA has taken steps to improve management of its major projects. defined as those projects and programs with an estimated life cycle cost higher than $250 million. But GAO, Senator Nelson, notes that there is room for further improvement, including in the areas of ensuring that NASA's workforce has the right skills to develop project cost and schedule estimates that meet best practices, as well as by demonstrating sustained improvement in cost and schedule performance for new, large, complex programs entering NASA's portfolio. Could you please illustrate for us the current and planned efforts that NASA is taking to continue to improve its management and cost effectiveness when it comes to major NASA projects?
And a lot of our expense, Congressman, is exactly on acquisitions, because you think what we do where we spend money, we acquire things, we build things, we create things. And so one of the first things that I did was make the Chief Acquisitions Officer also the Deputy Administrator, Colonel Pam Melroy, so that we can get this elevated right to the top. Now, I wish I could tell you just to put together a program office for the Moon to Mars program would be an easy thing. You have people that have a dog in the fight and they want their dog fed first. But we have it in place, and I have just named the program manager. And so whether it's Moon to Mars or whether it's a scientific instrument or whatever, we are trying to take this acquisition process and really tighten it up. And so thank you for raising it. I am told that we have instituted termination and continuation reviews for 7 of our major acquisition projects just in the last year and a half.
Well, thank you, Administrator Nelson, and please pass along my best regards to Colonel Melroy as well. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Elsey?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your comments, Mr. Cartwright. Yep, these are things we have to deal with, and as he said, we do have to ask you hard questions sometimes that we don't really want to, but these things do come to pass, and we are, you know, as you look at the, as you know, 70 cents on every dollar that we spend is already spoken for before it gets to any of us, and so I hope we can preserve what we need to get all the missions accomplished. Thank you for these photos from the Webb Space Telescope. Those are incredible, and so it's I think it's turning out even better than we anticipated. I look forward to the space telescope that we get in Chile as well. I wanted to ask you about your T-38 fleet. How are they holding up? Is there a replacement? And what's that timeline look like?
We're constantly looking in that. There are not nearly as many T-38s as there was when I was in the program 37 years ago. Because, first of all, the astronaut corps is a lot smaller. And now the requirements are not necessarily that you be a military test pilot, as was a requirement in the space shuttle, because it was the commander and the pilot that were military test pilots. The fact is, of this last class of about a dozen astronaut candidates, a good number of them are military pilots and test pilots. But that's not necessarily a requirement. There is a requirement now that every astronaut has to be able to do a spacewalk. In the space shuttle days, the commander and the pilot didn't do spacewalks because they had to tend to the store of the shuttle. But now everybody does, for the obvious reason. On the space station, they've got to be part of the international crew, sometimes all American, sometimes all an international crew, sometimes a combination, to go outside and fix things or add things that are sent up. So it's a new day. It's a new kind of astronaut. Back in the old days, in the original 7, they had to be all white male test pilots of a certain height. Space Shuttle changed that. You could get a lot taller folks, and it wasn't around until the class of 78 of astronauts that they had the diversity for the first time. Many women in that class, many minorities, not only African American, but Hispanic. Ellison Onizuka from Hawaii, Pacific of heritage. So you had a broadening of the astronaut class. So too, when you deal with doing a spacesuit, well, you got to adjust to all kinds of heights and weights in order to accommodate the new astronauts. And, just recently we had an all-female astronaut spacewalk, 2 females. And of course, they did it as good, if not better, than anybody else. So it's a new day, Congressman.
But do you have is there a replacement identified for the T-38, or is that going to hold on for a while?
Oh, I got to waxing eloquently
You
and got
did.
off the T-38.
Excellent salesman.
Well, I didn't intend that. I love the T-38. But they're telling me that I've got to go through the qualification to even climb in the back seat of one now, which I hope to do soon. The T-38 is serving its purpose for right now. I don't know off the top of my head what is the replacement.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you for your time today, sir.
Mr. Rappelsberger.
Coming to the end. First, again, thank you for your leadership. Space is something that I think really holds our country together. It costs a lot of money. We have to do it right, but we have to let our citizens know that this is part of our future and our security and our health, safety, and welfare. And so I am glad that we have a lot of people like yourself and from the military and those that are not, but that have been able to pull this system together, and we still keep the American people behind us, because that's one of the most important things, which means communication too. I'm a little concerned about a couple of missions. First thing, let me talk about Maryland. I have to take care of my state. Maryland is home of some of the nation's leading places where science missions are built and operated, including Goddard Space Flight in Greenbelt, Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Labs in Laurel, and the Space Telescope Institute in Baltimore. Despite NASA's budget being proposed for overall increases, I'm deeply concerned about some of the details in the proposal for space science. The Dragonfly mission, and was mentioned before, about a half an hour ago, mission to Saturn's moon Titan that is part of a new Frontier program is proposed for a cut of nearly 20%, making it virtually impossible, if that were enacted, to meet its proposed launch date of 2027, which is the target date, still listed. And there are other programs out there that are in the same situation. The mission has received glowing review at its recently completed preliminary decision review. It is scheduled for confrontation review sometime this summer. The number proposed in the budget this year, $327 million, a cut of nearly 20% below the FY23 appropriation, almost surely will result in the mission slipping to 28, 29 and cost us hundreds of millions of dollars. My concern, and doing some of the research, that NASA has calls for a significant increase in the Mars sample return project to nearly $1 billion, even though the mission has yet to reach its preliminary design review. And NASA's science director is so concerned that its cost and schedule that it has established an independent review board to check this out. And it seems a tall order to think that we can launch by June 2028. And I'm thinking, a suggestion, it would be a lot smarter to invest in funds to get Dragonfly on budget. They're where they need to be, passed all the tests, to move forward and then wait to see what MSR IRB determines before ramping up the budget this year and the Mars sample return. Budgeting is about priority. Budgeting is which way we're going to go. You have to make a lot of hard decisions. But when you have something ready to go and it's passed the test, and this is a very expensive program, and it's taken away from those ready to go. So I'd like your opinion on that.
Congressman, you've asked about two programs. You've asked about Firefly, and you've asked about the Mars sample return. We are still planning on Dragonfly being launched in '27. That has not changed. The project's going to be reviewed this year, and then we'll have the final cost and schedule for you. But as of right now, there is not any plan for cut in fiscal year 2024. What, of course, it goes on, and it's human nature. People get concerned, and that's why you mentioned the Mars return sample. Now, what is being asked, and I just found out about this 2 weeks ago, the Mars sample return wants another $250 million in fiscal year 2024, which of course starts this October the 1st, 2023. And of course, when that happens, others get concerned since we're dealing with a finite amount of money. By the way, a science budget, Mr. Chairman, that is the largest science budget ever, $8.3 billion just for science. And people start getting nervous. Where are you going to get that money from? Well, it's true. You can't put 10 pounds of potatoes in a 5-pound sack. So if you only have so much money, and if you have costs that are increasing on different projects, then you have to make those judgments as you go. And that's why we have this under review right now.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Senator, thank you for generously giving us this time with you and the conversation that we've enjoyed. There's a lot of reasons why NASA enjoys almost unanimous support here on the Hill, certainly bipartisan support, nonpartisan support, I should say. The nation is lucky to have you heading up NASA with your experience here on the Hill, especially so with us, because you know how to navigate the rapids that exist here on this Hill. And you are certainly a dedicated public servant of long standing, as well as a personal friend, I guess, of almost everybody in the House and the Senate. So thank you for your service. Thank you for your enthusiasm for this exciting program that we all share in admiring. So thank you for being here. That concludes today's hearing. Thank you, Senator, for attending. Without objection, all members will have 7 days to submit additional written questions for the witness or additional materials for the record. With that, this hearing is adjourned.